Cool. Yeah, so I will preface this with you all are my lovely test audience for a conference later on in the year. Thank you all for being here. We're going to talk about Ionic. And more or less, this is going to be kind of, has anyone used Ionic before? Okay, so a few people. Here and there. Basically, this is just going to kind of give like a state of the union, more or less, but we're just going to go over some of the things that we have been working on. With Ionic 4, we did like our next major release, and in this had a lot of changes, I think, to how we fit in as an integration layer with Angular. All for the better. And if you have any questions later on, I post a lot of cat pictures, so follow me on Twitter. Bump my numbers up. I would love that. So yeah, let's start off. We gotta go way, way, way back, a long time ago. We all had our favorite framework, AngularJS. I look back on these days with such happiness and joy, mostly because AngularJS was a breath of fresh air in the front end world. I had been doing Backbone, Knockout, Ember, and not to say that any of those frameworks are bad, they just didn't jive with how I thought of building web apps. AngularJS, it fit the mental model that I wanted to, develop it. And I was super happy with that. It felt like I could actually build stuff in the web and build proper web apps, which I was super proud of. And at the same time, we at Ionic were trying to build a UI kit that felt, fit the gap of people are trying to build these hybrid web apps, and they're just going to other CSS libraries that are traditionally meant for the desktop, which not really a good idea. So we came in and we figured, what can we do to ship, a standard set of components that can be used on iOS and on Android, respective platform designs that come with each one of those platforms, and make it fairly approachable for people who are just getting into web development and give them the tools they need to build web apps that can run on iOS natively and natively on Android. So other than just kind of waving the hands and showing you that, promising you that people are using Ionic, has anyone ever heard of Untapped? That's an Ionic app. Has anyone ever heard of Swirkit?
What?
Swirkit. Circuit work app. It is a health fitness app. It is the featured app in both iOS and Android. Has over 20 million downloads between the two platforms. Has been on Shark Tank. It's like an actual product that people are building out, and it's not just a hacker project in the back in someone's office. This other one I'm actually pretty interested in because I just got sous vide. It's called Jules. It's from a company called Chefstep. And this one on the far right, I'm also interested in, called Just Watch. They are an app that allows you to just search through various streaming services for different TV shows, movies. Basically, if you have Netflix, Hulu, HBO Now, you can figure out where can I watch this show at this exact moment, like right now. So it's a pretty nice app. So yes, there are people using Ionic and people building with Angular and having fairly moderate success. Swirkit probably the most successful, and so is, I would say, Untapped. But I think the biggest part that I actually like to think about is not just these one-off companies. There's millions of people who are using Ionic and Angular to build their apps, and have meetups all around the world that focus on this stuff. A lot of the feedback that we get from our users was that kind of felt like we had this web SDK. Back in the beginning of Ionic, we realized that native iOS and native Android aren't necessarily better based on technologies. They're better because they give developers this predefined toolkit. You can build, you know how a card works, or you know how tabs works in iOS and Android because that's already been defined for you. With Ionic, we kind of want to build that SDK, but for the web. Then came everyone's favorite day. And that was the migration from AngularJS to Angular. Does anyone remember seeing ng-conf 2015 when they went over a lot of the Angular 2, quote unquote, at the moment, kind of syntax, and they were like, here's the high level ideas. I was in the crowd that day. I was really nervous, but also optimistic because a lot of the ideas that they were trying to promote were like, yeah, that makes sense. That's a fairly, reasonable excuse for why to change a lot of things. Like that makes a lot of sense. And thankfully, like afterwards, we talked with a lot of the Angular team, and they invited us as collaborators on Angular 2 and all of the Angular versions since then. So like we were there since day one with Angular 2. Like, we kind of been involved and figured out how do we make this migration as easy and straightforward as possible. But the truth is, like between Angular 2, we had two different major releases. We had Ionic 1 and Angular 1, but then we also had Ionic 2, Ionic 3, all built on Angular 2, 4, 5. We had to make our own pieces to kind of bridge that gap that existed in Angular. I mean, at the time, Angular's router was in a difficult position, but it's gotten a lot better. CLI wasn't really a thing; it was still beta, and it wasn't as good as it is now. There wasn't really a good story for mobile interfaces, gestures, animations. Those things really didn't exist. So at Ionic, we really built out a lot of these pieces to figure out what can we do to complete the ecosystem. And we maintained a lot of those pieces. Like we maintained our own router, we maintained our own CLI, we maintained a lot of our own components and gestures and animations, like on our own time, just because they were needed. And while we were doing that, we kind of watched Angular improve. Ever since Angular 2.0, 4.0, 5, 6, 7, and soon to be with 8, we watched Angular grow. The CLI is top-notch now. If you're manually building your own build system with Angular, it's a real big waste of time. The Angular CLI is top-notch, and it fits like most of your use cases. The routing experience in Angular, as much as people have strong opinions on, say, ng modules and lazy loading, having touched other routers in the ecosystem, Angular's router is still probably my favorite to go back to. And it's just getting a lot better and a lot more features added to it to make it a better experience. And there's other features as well. Internationalization extraction. Has anyone tried that before? Has anyone even heard that? I expect to know that.
We're not long enough.
Yeah, well, you've tried it. Angular internationalization extraction, schematics, all these features that have been added to the CLI and to the Angular ecosystem, it really just pushes Angular to what I think is a better position than any other framework out there. So as we were going through building out Ionic 4, we wanted to say, let's take a step back. Let's think about what we can do to make Ionic take a second seat and let Angular handle all the big pieces. So like, handle all the routing, handle all of the tooling. And we just focus on components because, frankly, that's what we do the best. Everything else just kind of had to be built. But Angular has stepped up and has built those features. The first one I want to get into is routing. Now, from Ionic 2 and Ionic 3, we built our own routing mechanism. I would say with moderate success. Routing is a tough problem to solve in the web. because once you want to figure out how to route to anything, people then ask, how do I reload and maintain that? So we originally had taken the approach to say, what if we just had routing as an in-memory process? Similar to native. Native doesn't have reloads. But as soon as this idea of progressive web apps came about, that kind of went out the door, and we realized, oh, we should probably have good URL support. So as we started building that out and maintaining that and seeing a lot of the complexities that come in with routing, we realized there is a diminishing return on our focus here. We're not getting the best experience out of this. Our developers aren't getting the best experience out of this. And I think the most frustrating part for me as DevRel is that I saw Angular libraries create separate docs for the Angular way of doing things and then an Ionic way of doing things, which I was not really happy about. So I'm happy to share that with Ionic 4, we've completely said our old router system is gone. Use Angular Router. It's great. It has a lot of features, it has a lot of capabilities, and it kind of falls in line with being a de facto solution for Angular developers. So I've been building out this app on the right. It's basically just like an Apple Music clone. But all of this over here is essentially a default Angular router setup. Now, if you notice the load children import statement, this is an Angular 8 feature that is coming. It is fairly nice, no more magic string syntax. This is awesome. These are features that we wouldn't necessarily have if we had maintained our own routing solution. But we get to have a nice setup for saying, here's our route, here's our component, lazily load that in with an import statement, and in the app itself, we get to provide a nice experience of saying, animate this in, animate that out, go into that, and just fall in line with like an Angular ecosystem. We can take it a step further. Has anyone used an app with a bottom tabs layout before? Yeah, it's essentially a default, like kind of a go-to UI paradigm for any app. Well, this can be done as well inside of an Angular routing setup where we have this parent tabs component, and each tab itself is just a sub-child route that you can render. So we can have this tab UI over here where we are loading tab 1 lazily. It's just loaded when it's requested. Tab 2, that's loaded when it's requested. And tab 3 is loaded when it's requested. So we can have this really nice experience where everything is just extracted out. We don't have to worry about how do we get this to work with that, and the router takes care of all of that. This is a big change compared to how we've done things in v3 and v2 and different versions of Ionic. But I think this makes a lot of sense for Angular developers. I don't necessarily want to go back to the old way and having to maintain separate routing mechanisms and having to debug a couple of routing issues with v3 and now having to do it in v4. It's much simpler. So routing we figured out. Why don't we just go on to the Angular router? What about building and CLI tools? If you think back maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, the CLI ecosystem is quite different. There was build, run, kind of like the go-to build tools and task runners. There was also Browserify. Does anyone have any fond memories of Browserify? I do. System.js, which was a thing. Funny, it's coming back nowadays with import maps in Chrome, which I think is really interesting. But then there's also Webpack, which has been around much longer than I realized. And these aren't the only options that existed, and these aren't the only options that exist today. There's so many different tools out there to help you build your apps. You can go on Hacker News and find like 30 new ones in like right now, like 30 seconds, that's all it takes. As a user, this is kind of a confusing situation because I don't necessarily want to focus on how to build all these build tools, or how to configure them, or go through the docs and figure out, how do I do webpack config? I don't know. I don't have to deal with that though. Because the truth is, these tools have all evolved and become pretty stable and pretty feature, parity across the board. Like you go to Webpack, and you go to Rollup, you go to Parcel, or any other tools, they're pretty much fairly similar. Like you can go to all of them and get similar features, maybe in a different syntax or a different approach to how to do it, but at the end of the day, it's still the same thing. And more important, Angular devs don't really need to worry about this because we have the Angular CLI. CLI abstracts away all of this, so that way you just know I'm calling this task, and internally, Angular CLI knows how to handle that, which I think is really nice. And if in the future, a new build tool comes out, one that begins with T and ends with Bazel, the Angular CLI can adopt that, and me as an Angular developer, I don't really need to worry about configuring that or setting that up. I just install the build tool, and it works. Now, for Ionic 3, we had this thing called Ionic app scripts. And if you don't get the reference, Ionic app scripts was a very promising project that I had a lot of personal pain dealing with and maintaining and having to go through and configure Webpack, configure all these SAS tasks, configure basically an entire CLI in a single script. It was not scalable, to say the least. We realized that when we built it and released it after a couple months. We're like, there's a lot of work to maintain a build tool. I don't necessarily want to do that. And every second I spent maintaining this build tool is a second I don't have maintaining components. So there's a trade-off there. Like you have to either maintain the build tool, add new features, or you have to focus on the core framework itself, which is things that I don't want to do. And again, we get to this point where we see there's an Angular way of doing things and an Ionic way of doing things. I didn't really feel comfortable with that, and especially looking at, say, a good example is there were Firebase docs that had different examples of how to do this and set it up inside of environment variables. Why not just have it, use the same tool under the hood? And thankfully, went too fast. Thankfully, we've moved over to the Angular CLI and used all of the CLI build tools to more or less fall in line with how an Angular developer expects their app to be built. CLI is top-notch these days. I remember the early days when there was a lot of rough edges, but moving to CLI these days is pretty painless and very fast and efficient. There's a lot of new features also coming out in CLI that make it a no-brainer to move over. So now we have extraction of ES5 polyfills. So if you are building for for a modern browser, say like in Chrome, Safari, or Firefox, you will get all the ES6 features. But if you're going back to old Chrome, old Safari, IE 11, you will get all the ES6 polyfills, everything that you would expect to get for an older browser, kind of just loaded on demand. So we get this really nice experience with less code shipped to the new browsers, and all this is just automated. And there's also this new tool called Bazel that the Angular team has been talking about for a significant amount of time. Bazel itself is going to be really awesome because it's super fast. I don't have to, it's already configured up. It does all these reloads and rebuilds very quick. And having tried it myself, I'm super excited for it. But having stuck with Ionic app scripts, we would have to rewrite app scripts to support Bazel. With the Angular CLI, it's as simple as, it's probably going to be as simple as saying ng-add @Angular Bazel. And then our CLI project is already moved over to Bazel scripts. That's a theory. I don't have full answers. I'm not an Angular core member, so don't quote me on that. But we can see that the idea is that it's easier to adopt new tools as they come out, and as the Angular team says, this is the way we should go. And again, the one that I'm most happy with is there's one approach for the community. There's no way for people to go, this is the Ionic way, this is the Angular way, there's just the way. But while we realize that Angular CLI is great, we have strong opinions on how things should be done in the Ionic ecosystem. Thankfully, the Angular CLI offers an abstraction around schematics to configure your project to do certain things. So we created this package called Ionic Toolkit, or Ionic Angular Toolkit, where it's a bunch of opinionated schematics on top of components with the route, components in general, different build system, different build tools that will pass different options. So in this idea, we in our documentation say a route with a component or a component with a route is essentially a page. It's pretty self-explanatory. You go to a URL, this is a web page. So we go through and we've built out all of these different tools. They'll go ahead and say, all right, I'll generate a module, I'll generate the component in the template. I'll also update the routing module for you and include that into the router config, so that way you don't have to maintain that and manually do it yourself. So this does a lot of awesome features. One of them that I'm really proud of is lazy loading by default, which if you're not lazy loading, please think of your users and lazy load. But we also have been able to ship things like ng-add support. So if you are trying to add Ionic to an already existing project, you may not want all of the animations or all the transitions, but you just want some of the UI, ng-add at Ionic Angular. It'll take care of all the project configuration, it'll take care of all the imports, and handle that all for you. Things that we wouldn't be able to do without the Angular CLI. Now, this first half kind of was like a swan song, more or less, to the Angular community because it's so great and has a lot of awesome features that we should take care of, but we've also been doing a lot of work in Ionic itself, and I think we should talk about it. Has anyone heard of CSS variables? Okay, they're like the really new cool thing that everyone should be at least aware of and following. Basically, it's dynamic CSS. No CSS preprocessors. It's just the same CSS that you know and love. There is a property and there's a value, and you can change that property and that value on the fly via JavaScript or inside a component by component case, all without a preprocessor. So in here, this is an app I've been writing. This is the same Apple Music clone. We can see as I'm toggling dark mode in macOS's settings, I can have an instant dark mode by changing 15 lines of CSS, and it uses the media query. So this is all like standards-based tooling, and I don't have to write like a whole nother CSS file and ship it down to the browser, and load that up, and then make my users wait while I'm parsing all the CSS. This is really easy to do, and it's a very future-friendly feature. This one we are working on at the moment, but I figured it's worth teasing, making server-side rendering pretty easy. One of the big things that we've been working on with Ionic 4 is this move towards web components. And one of the constant pieces of feedback that we kept hearing from people is that you can't server-side render web components. There is no DOM, it's never going to work, why bother trying, just stop. Well, we have spent a lot of time and figured out, no, you can server-side render web components. And we've been going through the effort to work with Angular Universal to create our own server-side module that you can add and pre-render all your different routes. So if you are, say, wanting to do an app shell pattern, where you pre-render this landing shell or app shell, where it's just a toolbar and some minimal UI, you can pre-render that and have that inline inside of your app.html, or inside of your index.html, inside of the app root components. So all of this just kind of integrates with Angular official tooling, and that kind of goes along the line of integrate with what Angular is doing, do what Angular does. Like, what would Angular do in this situation? And the Hydrate module for Ionic is a good step forward with this. we've also gone through and said, what if we got rid of our own virtual scroll component? This is still being talked about internally, but I figure it's a pretty awesome feature. Angular has their own virtual scroll component through the CDK, and if you've ever used it before, has anyone used it before? You just one? It's actually really nice. It's very, very smooth, very fast. Here we're loading up a couple hundred people, and then infinitely or lazily loading more as we scroll towards the bottom. But you notice that even if we get to, I'm not going to step in front, but you notice that scroll bar all the way to the right is pretty small. So we can handle this huge list of data and not have any scrolling performance hits. Basically say, oh, scrolling is always slow on the web. We can move away from that. And CDK is fairly good with this, and we're able to say, this is a framework level decision. We shouldn't be in charge of this, especially if there's an official solution from the framework that provides a great experience. So I think this is a good step forward for us, more or less. I don't want to maintain my own virtual scroller. I'd rather contribute to something that goes back to the framework itself. And then we've been rethinking on how you can go ahead and build out your apps to target not just native iOS and native Android, but REST web apps as well, and also target other options like Electron. Electron is a really popular solution for building desktop apps. Why not build an Electron app with Ionic and Angular? We have been going through this, and we've got some pretty good ideas, but it kind of aligns with how we think web development should be. All open source, all using open technologies, not using proprietary platforms, and having 100% code reuse everywhere. So that same Electron app can run on iOS and Android and on the web, literally not changing a single line of code. This project itself is called Capacitor. If you do have questions about this in like a second or two, I'll happily go over all of them. But we think this is a good direction forward and kind of moves in line with Angular and Ionic as well. But just kind of like a closing thought. Our main goal with V4 was not only to just move away from this no framework approach by adopting web components, but to say, if a framework is a good enough ecosystem, let the ecosystem manage itself. We can come in and add pieces where we want, but Angular is a great ecosystem and a great platform to build on. It has everything from server-side rendering to the CLI, routing, and even third-party setups like ng-conf. Take advantage of all that, and we can come in and just provide great components. It's what we know. It's what we know how to do really well, and we can just focus on that and build great components that make a fast user experience. And developers can just build awesome apps using Angular and our components and have a great experience. So if you do have any questions, I would like to take them now. Yes?
Has anything changed on the build process? Like I used to use Angular and Ionic I used to use PhoneGap their site because I can't pay. I have free over there. So
No.
has that changed?
Yeah, that's changed. So if you want to build your, so question, being able to build your app locally or in the cloud, our pro paid services allow you to do free remote builds from the command line. So as soon as you push that commit up to Ionic, to our own kind of mini Git service, you can trigger a build automatically, and that's free to a certain amount. But it's enough to get you started and kind of point you in the right direction of, do you want to maintain your own build service, or do you want to help fund an open source project by paying for a monthly subscription to do that. And if you want to do just the builds, that's its own rate. And if you want to do live code deploys and all these additional features, that's stuff that you can just kind of add on to yourself.
Can you still use formula?
You can. That's still a feature that you can do. Depends on what you need. Any other questions?
Well, I don't quite understand with capacitor. You're talking about that doing cross component. Is that going to, I mean, you have your components, so I thought capacitor was sort of replacing the phone gap layer.
More or less.
Right, enhancing and replacing. I know it also will allow capacitor.
So we are looking at it as an attempt to do something slightly different than Cordova, taking a lot of inspiration from, say, React Native and other projects that are out there, where we say the native layer you should be able to build inside of that. So if you're building a native iOS project, you should be able to use CocoaPods. In Android, use Java Android libraries and be able to pull them down and have that just kind of work. But then also inside of Electron, be able to pull in different Electron packages and have that all work as well, and have the web layer itself separated from the native layer. And then as you want to add, say, a good example would be a SQLite storage. You can do that in Electron, in iOS, and Android. But the integration layer with, say, the web, there is no, WebSQL has been deprecated, and there is no like native SQL storage on the web. So what we can do instead is create this abstraction layer that's essentially built on top of a key value pair, where you are basically setting all this rich data. In iOS, Android, and Electron, it will use a SQL compatibility layer, and on the web, it will use IndexedDB. So it's essentially replacing the Cordova layer, but pushing it a step further, where you, instead of using the web standard APIs, you are coding against a capacitor API that will go ahead and translate those layers out for iOS, Android, Electron, and web.
You're selling it for the hybrid app, right? So,
It's still web technologies at the end of the day, which I see as a feature because it's easier to debug, go through and measure performance, and bring in your existing dev tool experience in, say, Chrome, versus having to relearn, say, Xcode instruments.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand where it lies.
Yeah. So it's still using web code, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the UI and the presentation there. The real story is kind of behind the scenes in the native tools when you want to bring in, say, camera API, Bluetooth, or other device-specific features.
But isn't that sort of that's a replacement for Cordova? Although I know it also allows you to bring Cordova.
Yes. Sure.
One, using device-specific library limit add that you're building to certain platforms?
So that is a using device-specific features and being limited to certain platforms. We have seen all the platforms kind of coalesce around the same core features. So you might be on iOS and want to use Touch ID or Face ID. You might want to be on Android and use their fingerprint sensor.
For the libraries that you spoke about, like if I wanted to use something in Electron that's just available there, but there's no similar library on Android or iOS side, then the app that you build, it's not going to run on the other side.
So that's a good point. We have been working with community members to kind of work through this and figure out, like, what do you think the best solution is for that? I'm of the mindset that if there's a feature in Electron that might not exist in, say, the native platforms, either do we build out those features in the native platforms, like make custom like native Swift for iOS and Java or Kotlin for Android? Do we write that custom code to implement it, or do we just not make that feature exist? Do you have any good examples of that?
No, I was just asking in general.
Right. Those kind of questions. it's kind of one of those things where it's like when that becomes a topic of concern, like we will kind of cross that bridge when we get to it, more or less. But we're kind of seeing all of these platforms just kind of coalesce around the same core functionality, like alerts, modals, file system access, storage that is secure. So those kind of core principles exist across all platforms. And if you want to integrate, say, Facebook or Fire-based integration layers with iOS, Android, Electron, you can handle that as well. Those are all platform solutions. So any other questions? Yes? No? Maybe so?
So the dynamic loading, you were showing some code in there with the import, and then you had event, and can you do that now?
So there's a great blog post that just came out from the Angular GDE about this. You, in theory, can. Where the magic kind of comes in and why we have to use the string syntax in the Angular project. Right. The regular path to the module, hashtag module. The reason why we have to do that is because the Angular CLI looks for ng factories, which break if you try to do this. So what the Angular CLI and the router, more or less, in version 8 are doing are moving away from factory files. This is part of the Ivy update. So they move away from factory files and just use this module this import statement.
Okay, so this is just an Angular 8.
Right, this is an Angular 8 example. This will be coming though, and you can start to install Angular CLI at Next and test it out. I have a great example, actually. We'll go off the cuff real quick.
Because right now, Ionic has issues if you try to lazy load multiple components on Angular 8. Life is not fun.
We have actually gone through and worked around that. So if you are, say, using a tab application, is that weird?
So if you've got a tab application, then on that page you have 2 or 3 things that you want to lazy load. You can't have more than, it assumes you have one tab that you're going to lazy load off, right, essentially. And so you have problems if you try to lazy load down low.
Right, so that actually has been addressed, and we move this over to the main screen. Actually, I'll just hit play because that might be easier to show up. In this example, right here we go. So this is the tab example. We have this children property here, and while this is inline, you can extract this out into its own load child statement. So you could have path, tabs, component, load children, and then that would handle lazy loading all of this. And you can take it a step further. So in each tab component, more or less, if we think of each one of these being an entry in the tab's child array, this could be its own load child, or load children. This could be its own load children entry. This could be its own load children. And then this top level one could be its own load children. So all of this can be extracted out. And this is something that we worked on before we hit 4.0 final. Because this is something I was pretty loud about and making sure that we got done. This is an important feature to have if you want to be fast and performant on lower-end devices. So this can all be abstracted out. This is the default approach that we ship in our CLI. It doesn't impact your performance to do it this way. To do it the other way, it also doesn't impact or increase your performance to do it that way. But either way, each tab itself can be its own lazy loaded component. And if you want to see, let's actually.
And will you get performance benefits on the native device, like you would on the web? Even though it's loading locally?
Yes, because there's still a parse time that you have to deal with when loading components, say, even though it's from the local file system, you still have to deal with the browser's parse time. So by lazy loading everything, you're avoiding the parse time and making things theoretically faster. Though what we've noticed is that that load time or parse time in most modern devices is fairly minimal. So just to prove this, yes, I use Vim. You can comments to yourself. We'll go in here. We have this tabs page component with its own tab router module. And let's see what we got. We have this routes array with an array of children, which are all individual tabs. We'll only look at one just because that's all we really need. Now, this is the schedule tab. So this is like the first thing where we want to go to, where it shows a list of data. Each entry in this, so this is just going to load the schedule page. We do this inline because we want to have this render right away. You can make this an import statement or a load children statement. Here we have the second kind of sub-route within that tab, which is also lazy loaded. So this allows us to handle situations where we don't necessarily want to pay the cost of rendering that up front. We can lazy load that down the road. And same thing goes with the rest of the different routes. So we just can go here and basically see that everything is lazy loaded except for that initial tab view, which is what we would want. Does that answer your question?
Actually, mine's about having like on the lazy loaded tab that you pull up, be able to lazy load multiple components onto that.
Onto the tab itself. Yeah. So something like where the tabs themselves become their own lazy loaded property. Is that what you mean?
No, so let's say you pulled up that tab, the app tab, the tutorial tab. Yes. And on the tutorial you have two different components. Let's say those are expensive to load, or two different pieces of it that you lose in different places. And you want to put both those, so you basically put two tab components in there. Yes. Make those lazy load. That won't work.
So there's a different approach that we have seen with this. Aptly named Lazy AF. There is a awesome community project by Aaron Frost to lazy load individual components, basically declaratively instead of using factory component resolver. It'll do that all under the hood. You just pass in the reference to the module, and it'll create that and load it instantly for you.
What was that called?
Lazy AF. It's a wonderful name component. There is a lot of sarcasm there if you can look that up. Yeah, it's essentially just saying on condition lazy load this if that condition meets true, which I
built one of these myself, but it ended up like scrapping it was too much of a hassle. There's so much around you can get it basically to work, but you're fighting so that's very cool.
Definitely check this out. Aaron's another Angular GDE and super passionate about this stuff. So he has been working on this. The Angular team has also heard this feedback before and have incorporated this in Ivy. So they are aware that lazy loading on encode splitting essentially on a component by component basis is not easy when it does not have to involve a route. So they are aware of this and are looking to make progress with this. But Lazy AF is one that I am currently aware of that does this, that solves this problem really well. Any other random questions? Yes?
Any difference between Ionic and Angular if one is using reactive coding and ng-conf and Angular, and Alberto's goes to Ionic, would be any differences in performance or running those codes?
Not necessarily. There wouldn't. So, is there a difference between running Ionic and Angular versus running just pure Angular with NGRX and kind of like this reactive mindset? There isn't really a difference. So actually, I have, and kind of, thank you for reminding me, there is this little experiment that I have been working on called Ion NGRX, and it's just a test app that I've been working on to kind of maybe provide to like a default setup from our CLI, like Ionic start, my app, Ion NGRX, like provide the scaffolding for this. You can add NGRX to an Ionic app, and the performance hit, there wouldn't really be a performance like issue that you would have to deal with. I would suggest what?
It improves it.
Yeah, it would improve your performance because at this point you're only loading the Ionic components that are being used. They're all lazy loaded by default onto the hood. But you would also get the benefit of having a, I would say, better architected app. Depending on your use cases, depending on like a million different things. But you could have this entire situation where the entire app itself is basically a Redux kind of like flow, and all you're doing is just coding the UI and dispensing the actions. So I have done it before. I like it. Again, depending on your use cases and on your app, NGRX is not a one-size-fits-all. Redux itself is not a one-size-fits-all. So, hopefully that answers your question. Cool. Awesome. Anything else? If not, thank you so much for having me.